My special guest for this episode is Ambassador Aloun Ndombet Assamba, Jamaica's former High Commissioner to the Court of St. James, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and High Commissioner to Cyprus, and served concurrently as Ambassador to Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Ireland. Ambassador Assamba represented Jamaica at several international fora. She is a former Minister of Tourism in Jamaica, where her initiatives as Minister continue to enhance Jamaica's tourism product. An attorney at law, Ambassador Assamba has been instrumental in the role and development of credit unions in Jamaica's national development. Ambassador Assamba, I am pleased to welcome you. Ambassador, one of the issues that lots of people are discussing now, should Jamaica sever ties with the monarchy and become a republic?
You know, the question of removing ourselves from the monarchy as our head of state is deeply entrenched. That means that in addition to having the 2/3 majority in the House, we have to have a referendum.
Definitely.
No, you can get a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives. That is the lower house where the MPs sit. But in the upper house, you will need to have at least one member of the party which is not in government to agree.
Yes.
Now, prior to this, we have never been able to get an agreement with the opposition as it was in those years from 1989, I would say, until now.
But there is broad agreement now, isn't there?
There is broad agreement. And you know, the reason why you have to get the two parties agreeing on this matter is that in the referendum, you would have to have community discussion. You would have to have basically like you're running an election to get the referendum. You know,
that's right.
we so if you don't have both parties in agreement that says this is something that we want, then one party can go out and says this is something that we want, and the other party can go out and says we are not into it.
And part of the problem is there were some difficulties in determining what format our Republican status should be.
We have reached a point now, as I understand it, that there is an agreement in principle with both parties. The outstanding matter is whether we should have an executive president or whether we should have an appointed president. So to have an appointed president, you would have basically that appointment being done in the way how the Governor General is now appointed.
Correct.
To have an executive president, you would now have to have an election by the broad electorate to determine who that person is to be. And that is where we have a challenge at the moment.
Right.
There are many people who are of the view that if we become a republic, then we won't be a part of the Commonwealth, and that is not true, because of the 54 countries that are in the Commonwealth now, a number of them have never had the monarch of the UK as their head of state. And only 14 currently, including Jamaica and the UK, have the monarch as head of state. Only 14. And there are 54 countries in the Commonwealth.
That is really shouldn't even be an issue. But my question really is, should we now be moving at greater speed than we are moving? Because clearly the Prime Minister said we are moving on, but we seem to be moving at a snail's pace.
I agree with you. I have to agree with you. And I am very disappointed that we are moving at such a snail's pace, given the fact that the Prime Minister removed Minister who was the Attorney General from being Attorney General and giving her another post, which is for constitutional reform. And therefore, it suggested that work was going to be done at a faster pace.
Yeah.
But so far, I haven't seen anything coming out of that new Ministry of Constitutional Reform that suggests that this is being done.
Nobody knows about it.
But nobody knows about it. Yes, nobody knows about it.
But Ambassador, the Prime Minister established a new cabinet position and installed a new minister to move this forward. We know legislation has to be drafted and introduced into the Parliament and so on. And we don't see any activities. As you quite rightly say, public education is essential to this process. As we saw in Barbados, they had a period of public consultations and so on.
But they didn't need to have a referendum.
And they didn't need a referendum.
And you understand why that is so? And I want to just explain a bit in case people are saying, so why is it that Jamaica's position is entrenched, whereas Barbados was not?
That's
so
right.
Deeply entrenched. And you will recall that we were the first country to have gained independence. So by the time Barbados came around, there was some learning that had already taken place. And therefore, they didn't need to put that in that constitution. But we were the first. We were kind of like the guinea pigs.
I was about to use that term.
Yes.
Okay. So now we need to move forward, and we need to move forward a little bit of pace.
Yes.
Because I also saw a recent poll where the majority of Jamaicans already believe we should I shouldn't use the word dumb, but we should sever our ties to the monarchy. And with the passing of Queen Elizabeth, which seemed to have had some sentimental attachment across the Jamaican public, with King Charles III now the monarch, I don't see that the same kind of attachment exists in Jamaican society. And perhaps now is an opportune time.
Very opportune.
To step up the pace.
Very opportune. And in fact, so many of us grew up only knowing the Queen as the head of state.
Yep.
And having a very a feeling of warmth towards us. I don't think we can deny that. Although there are persons who have a different view based on the issue of head of state.
Right.
But they don't feel the same way about Charles.
No.
King Charles.
No.
But to be fair to him, he has indicated that he would have no problems with countries moving from having the monarch as their head of state.
His speech in Barbados is evidence of that too.
Very much so. So I believe that the country is ready to move forward.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the country is waiting on the government to begin that process, because
we seem not to have much of a choice.
That is how we are set up.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to another issue, which has been discussed in many fora: reparative justice. And the question I ask, are Jamaicans and the nation entitled to reparative justice from the United Kingdom for the hundreds of years of enslavement and colonial exploitation? And if so, why?
Well, you know, it is really funny, but in 2015, while I was High Commissioner in London, I was invited to debate this very same topic at the Oxford Union. And every once in a while, this particular piece of the debate with my saying, yes, we are entitled to reparative justice. It surfaces, because the minute you start to talk about it, then I know it is going to be showing. In that particular debate, there were three of us debating. Member of Parliament from India. He used to be a Deputy Secretary General for the UN. I can't remember his name. And I and a student at Oxford debated. We did not have any discussion beforehand about what slant we were going to take, but we all took the same slant. And we won the debate. In that debate, I made the point that CARICOM has set up a group to look at reparations and set out a number of issues that we need to bring to the fore. When people talk about, you know, when you talk about reparations from the UK, people said, well, what about from the other European countries that enslaved Africans in our region? We didn't have many of them here. We had the British. So our claim would be against the British. So I am in full agreement. And there's been a lot of talk about what it is that the British left in Jamaica. Whatever the British left here, they left here. Let me put it this way. Whatever the British did here was to enhance their ability to do the business that they were doing in Jamaica.
Correct.
They were not doing anything with the view that says, I'm going to leave back in Jamaica something that will help the Jamaicans to cope. They did not. In fact, we all know that they paid the slave owners money to release the slaves that they owned, the enslaved people. But the enslaved people got nothing. They were just, in fact, left on their own. And, you know, I like to tell this story because when I was campaigning to be Member of Parliament in Southeast St. Anne, I would go into some communities and I would say to myself, how in God's name did people leave the plantations and come to live in these places? Because there was no infrastructure, nothing that was put in place. And you know, this argument that is taking place in Jamaica now about the ownership of land, that's another issue, because the enslaved people got nothing. Nothing.
That is correct.
All the land was owned by the crown. That all the land that didn't have ownership by the slave masters. And I don't know how they got those.
And that was handed over to the Jamaican government at independence.
At independence.
And they still hold on to thousands and thousands of acres of land, while thousands and thousands of Jamaicans are landless.
I am telling you. But you know, that is another, unless you had that as one of the things for us to discuss, but that is something that could take a whole program.
We will have to do another program to
as I sit here where I live in rural Jamaica, and I look out, I see all these mountains, all of the land up there in front of me are what is called crown lands, owned by the government of Jamaica. But the question that I think has been asked more and more now is those families who own land in Jamaica that has been passed down through their generations. How did they get the land in the first place?
Most of it was given to them by the crown.
And I have to admit, I had to pay for the piece of land that I now live on.
That's right.
But if you trace back the ownership of that piece of land, the title was so old that when I bought this property, the titles office issued me with a new title. So the title I have does not have the history of the ownership of the land, but it is there. It is there at the titles office.
Oh, yes.
Because the new title makes reference to the older title.
Part of the problem is doing research in Jamaica is
so
very
hard.
difficult.
It's very difficult.
But I don't want us to go off too much on the land.
Off too much on what? Yes.
Right, because that's another subject that we need to discuss.
We need to discuss.
But
when
I look at the nature of what reparative justice should look like, you mentioned the landless, number one.
Yes.
But the other issue is that when the British left us in 1962, 80% of Jamaicans were illiterate.
Yes.
The infrastructure to educate Jamaicans were just not present.
Not present.
What they were educating in those preferred environment that they created were to feed into UK development. Now, I was listening to a broadcast recently by one of the advocates of reparative justice. And he was saying, he was making a speech. What he said is, nowhere is it possible to develop a country in 60 years when you start out with 80% illiteracy and lack of infrastructure, financial resources, untrained educators or not sufficiently trained educators, etc., to move the country forward. So when I speak of reparative justice, I'm saying that our education system needs an infusion of significant amount of resources. That is one area. The other area is certainly making it possible for the distribution of land and entrepreneurship development and so on. So there are so many different things that need to be done under this rubric of reparative justice.
I agree with you. And remember, I started off by saying that the people who are against it are asking who is going to get the money and how it is going to be spent. I'm not suggesting at all that anybody is to get money to go into their pockets.
Exactly.
It is to improve the educational infrastructure that we have. It is also to improve the physical infrastructure that we have, because as I said before, the only physical infrastructure that was left by the British was that infrastructure which was put in place to support their business.
Exactly. And in the rural areas, where many of the former enslavers live in the hilly parts of the country. And you mentioned when you were campaigning in St. Anne.
What I didn't go further to say is that once I was making a speech, and when I went to that particular area and saw what it took to get there,
the roads.
I just started to speak and I said, and I'm going to say this, I hope you're not going to cut it out. But can you imagine that after slavery, without any roads, without any infrastructure to get here, our people found themselves up in the hills of this country, all over Jamaica. I said, to get away from the slave plantations.
Yes.
It means that we can talk all what we want to say, but slavery was a bitch.
It was, and it won't be cut out, trust me, because it was. And the truth is, I saw some of that evidence. In 1992, I was on a political campaign up in the hills of Westmoreland into St. Elizabeth in the Newmarket area. And I cannot understand myself how they were able to survive. And the other issue now that we're faced with is the whole issue of mining in the cockpit country, taking away the livelihoods of many of these people who have survived and supported their families over the years under some very difficult situations. But that's another situation. That's another
discussion. There's so many things.
There's so many things.
But the fact is that, yes, the fact is that the issue of land for the landless in our country is a very serious issue. It is an issue that if it is not, it is like almost a powder keg at the moment.
Yes.
And it has to do with taking away lands where people have settled. And it has to do with an equitable distribution of the lands that are in ownership of the government. And that is something that needs to be discussed.
Yes.
The infrastructure needs of this country is, you know, we are building highways, that is true. But when you live in rural Jamaica and you see the condition of the roads.
And everybody know this, Ambassador. Everybody know of the terrible conditions of the farm roads getting into these areas.
Yes.
So farmers can take their produce to market.
Yes.
And yet nothing is being done. So reparative justice includes those things. But as an ambassador serving Jamaica at the highest level to King James, what do you call it again?
Court of St. James.
Court of St. James. And also ambassador to some countries like Norway and some of the
Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland,
the Scandinavian,
Ireland, and Cyprus. I think there are 6 countries.
all the way to Cyprus, right?
Yes.
You have represented Jamaica, like I would say, at the highest level on the global stage, at the bilateral and international levels.
Yes.
Attending international fora and so on. During your tenure as a diplomat representing Jamaica at these levels, how were Jamaica's positioning on global geopolitical and other bilateral issues impact your work as a senior diplomat compared to what you see now as what, in my mind, is an incoherent foreign policy by the current government? I really need your candid response to this.
You've opened a can of worms there, you know.
I know.
And
that's what I do.
as a diplomat representing Jamaica, I knew very clearly Jamaica's position on international issues.
Amen.
I knew very clearly. I served under A.J. Nicholson as the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah.
I had excellent staff in the High Commission. These are career civil servants who knew, who came up through the system and who gave me, in addition to my knowing the political side of it, who gave me excellent advice insofar as Jamaica's foreign affairs view of the world. So we had no challenge in knowing what position we needed to take on issues. And certainly if there was an issue that I felt I was not really au fait with or clear, I could call.
Yes.
If I didn't get the minister, I could speak to the permanent secretary.
Yes.
And know immediately the position that we have historically taken, because I think that's an important thing, and the position which is current. Now, I see what is happening here. I can never, as a person who, as you say, sat at that level in our diplomatic corps, these days, I could not tell you what I expect to get from Jamaica in these fora. There always was a point. There were many times when I'd keep quiet and I would listen to what everybody else is saying. And there always came a point when somebody would say, well, let us hear what Jamaica has to say. People wanted to hear what we had to say. And many times I was able to articulate our position very clearly. And nobody at the end of the day could have a question as to what it is that Jamaica is saying on these particular matters.
And you know something else that is very important? Many would listen to us and change their position.
Yes, that is what
and be guided by us and follow us, because they saw the integrity and the core principles that we defended, and they felt that they needed to be on board.
In fact, whenever it got to the point where somebody would say, well, what is Jamaica saying on this matter? I knew that it was to help to solidify a decision that they also wanted to make. That's and right. Whatever we said gave the kind of guidance that would allow them. I was always very surprised to be invited to caucus meetings prior to going into a large meeting.
Yes.
Where I could share the Jamaican position. That's so right. That a group in that caucus would come away with two things: either supporting our position, which they had already decided to do prior to the exchange, or saying, we want to have another discussion with our headquarters.
That's right. That's right. No, I was about to raise that because I have had experiences at the UN where we're considering resolutions, and ambassadors from other countries would come to us and ask, what is Jamaica's position on X, Y, and Z? Because our capital needs to know.
Exactly. Before
they decide.
Yes.
You see? Is that still happening, Ambassador?
I have no idea.
You're so diplomatic, Ambassador.
I have been fortunate to have maintained relationships with persons who served with me and who are still serving.
Yes.
And I will leave it at that.
Well, I'm glad we were able to bring this in, because that is one of the many things that you did and which needs to be highlighted. And perhaps we can do another interview, because there are so many other things we need to discuss.
Whenever you're ready.
Ambassador, I want to thank you so very much for the time we spent together on this interview.
Thank you.
I've been assured in my own mind that there's support for the right things going forward, and that there are people in Jamaica and in the diaspora who are on the same page when it comes to a number of issues affecting Jamaica and the entire Caribbean.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you again, and until next time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to another discussion with you where we can delve into some other things.
Great pleasure, and I look forward to it too. Thank you, Ambassador.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Ambassador Curtis Ward.